Greetings, this is the Grumpy Old Slan, and today we're going to take a look at the February 1924 issue of Weird Tales, starting with the cover, which after last issue's cowboy shows us a Native American apparently calling down lightning. It's not the most exciting cover, though it's quite well rendered, and I think it makes a nice diptych with the previous cover. So the last few covers still had nothing to do with any of the stories in the magazine, so I'm not holding my breath for this one, though it would have been nice to see a story with a scene like this. Let's get into the issue. Again, the table of content is near the end and shows us that we have 16 pieces of fiction. Seabury Quinn is back again with his weird crime column. And of course, there's the Erie. The first story is Planet Paradise by Dick Presley Tooker. This is a space romance. It's basically about a young man who is convinced that Mars is much closer than the millions of kilometers that conventional science believes it to be. Will build a rocket of sorts to travel to it to prove his theory that it is much closer. He will land. Of course, this Mars is inhabited. He will befriend a group of humans who live there, whose queen has seen a prophetic vision showing his arrival. They will have some adventures, including conflict with another nearby group, and the only way he has to turn the tide of battle will be to use his rocket, which after the landing he's managed to fix up so he can get back to Earth. Firing it will destroy the opposing army and also means the rocket leaves without him, so he is now stuck on Mars, and the story ends with him, of course, marrying the Martian princess, and the rocket, strangely enough, hanging in space somewhere. Since its engines stop thrusting, it just stops. A fun little space romance, though the science is even worse than some of the other stories we've read in this magazine or in other space romances of the period. It was still relatively entertaining and I quite enjoyed it. Next, we have The Tap by Arthur Edwards Chapman. This is a short story of a ghost haunting a man who moved into a new flat. Shortly before 11 every night, the tap in his bathroom starts to drip. He gets a plumber to try and fix it. This does not work. Eventually, it's not just dripping, it starts to flow more and more. He will talk to a friend of his about this, a friend who's interested in psychic phenomena. The friend lets him know that there had been a murder in his flat several months ago, and that this may be the ghost trying to complete an action, namely the action of filling up a glass of water, which was not completed because the person doing so was murdered. So they provide a glass, and the glass will float in the air until it is below the tap. The tap will open up, fill the water. The glass will be tilted, and instead of water pouring out, the water just disappeared as though the ghost was drinking it. And that's the end of the story. The ghost stops haunting the flat because its unfinished action is now finished. I've mentioned before I'm not super fond of ghost stories, but this one was fairly original and I quite enjoyed it. Next is The Thing That Should Not Be by Burton Peter Thom. The narrator of the story relates how some murders that occurred in a laboratory a few years before were solved, even though the thing wasn't really made public. We'll find out why later in the story. And essentially, at this one laboratory, this medical research institute, one of the doctors who was staying late one night is found the next morning dead. A knife was used to slit his throat, and the only unusual thing is that the pool of blood below the body doesn't correspond to the exsanguinated state of the body. The police, however, have no clue, no suspect. And 2 weeks later, another person is found dead in similar circumstances. And a few weeks later, it was one of the monkeys that the lab had that is found dead and exsanguinated. The narrator then decides that it needs more than just police investigation and logic to figure out what is happening, and he calls upon a friend of his who he describes as very intelligent. He's also a medical doctor and also has imagination, which he believes is something that will help him figure out the story. And he does. He will tell his friend that he believes he's figured it out. But to confirm it, we need to catch the perpetrator in the act. So they will go in the lab, hide, and lie in wait. Eventually, some of the monkeys in the lab start acting up. They come out of hiding and shoot what seems to be attacking the monkeys without clearly seeing it because it's dark. And when they turn on the light, they find it is an awful chimera made up of various body parts from various animals. This is one of the experiments that they were doing in this lab. Clearly, ethics guidelines were non existent in this lab. They thought it was dormant, like living but inactive, but it was actually active. The conclusion being that some spirit had taken over the body and wanted blood, and so the nutritional fluids that would get injected were not enough for it. It would go and kill to drink the blood. I just did not like this story all that much. There are not enough clues given for us to be able to guess what the thing that should not be is. What the experiments that they're conducting is brought about as you find out what the thing is. So there's no hints allowing you to maybe guess what is happening in a reasonable way. We also now have a short poem called The Ghost by Mary Sharon, which I quite liked. I'll be doing a reading of it, so you can check it out. I'll put a link up. Next, we have The Guilty Man by Marion Carrere. This is about a farmer who is jealous and angry and hates his neighbor for a variety of reasons. The neighbor is doing better financially. They were rivals in love, and not only did the neighbor win the hand of the woman they were both after, but she passed away shortly after the marriage, which the main character blames on his neighbor he's jealous of. While he's not perfect and he knows it, among other things, he drinks too much. He's been given advice by his neighbor, with whom he used to be friends, and he feels that this was done out of contempt. Again, it's another reason for him to dislike and hate his neighbor. He decides that he is going to kill his neighbor after his neighbors accused him of stealing some of his cattle. He plans it all out. His neighbor lives essentially alone. He does have a farmhand. However, the farmhand lives in a shack that's several hundred yards away. So if the deed is done quietly with a knife instead of a gun, it won't wake the farmhand up and no one would know it's him. He finally sneaks into the house of his neighbor, intent on killing him, only to find his neighbor already dead. While he's staring at the dead body in shock at what he's seeing, the farmhand walks in on him. They'll have a discussion, but eventually the main character figures out it's the farmhand who killed him. He will confront him with this, and the farmhand will confess that in a fit of rage he killed his boss. At this point, they know that police is coming. The main character will tell the farmhand, look, I came here to kill him. I was planning to be a murderer. You killed him in a fight because you were enraged at something he said to you. The law would consider you a murderer, but I am more of a murderer since I planned it and I lived this murder in my mind many times over. When they come, tell them I'm the murderer and you can go free, which is what does happen. So again, not one of those stories with anything supernatural or fantastical in it, but one with a series of strange events and circumstances. It was well written, the characterization is quite good, and I did enjoy it quite a bit. Highly recommend this one. Next, we have the first installment of The Transparent Ghost by Isa-Belle Manzer. Before I talk about this story, I just want to go back 2 issues to a letter that was published in the Erie, a letter by this same person. that accompanied the manuscript she submitted. The letter, like the story, is in very bad English. The editors, I think in a tongue-in-cheek way, said, well, if you like the letter, we can publish the story if enough people ask us to. Trolls being trolls, even before the internet, I guess enough people asked for it. Hence the little byline at the top that this story is published by popular request. The editors washing their hands of any responsibility for the story being in the magazine, and I cannot blame them for it. I tried to read the first paragraph and it's just such a hard slog. The English is so bad that I just gave up. That's it. It's the first story I haven't read in one of these magazines. I'm sure there'll be others, but there we go. Next, we have Corals of Darkness. This one is also the first installment of a new serial. The story starts with a British colonel in charge of a small unit. They hear about an attack on a nearby village. They decide to go to their rescue. However, the attackers are about to overwhelm them when the cavalry comes to the rescue. The relief battalion showed up early and just in time. The commander of the relief unit meets the daughter of the present commander, eventually falls in love. However, during the battle, she was taken away, and when she came back, her personality seemed to be quite different. But slowly, she seems to be recovering with her parents' attention, but also with her suitor's attention. Things come to a head when they go riding, they go into the jungle. Her personality will completely change. She just will rush into the jungle. And when her suitor finally catches up to her, she seems completely different. But he manages to bring her back. And a few days later, as they're trying to take a walk to get her to feel better, they come across a snake charmer and she just gets entranced with it, grabs one of the snakes, much to her fiancé's horror. We're not quite sure what's going to happen because we'll need to wait until the next issue. I like this story so far. It could still go either way, depends on how it's concluded. But certainly the strange personality that seems to have taken over the young girl is well developed. The people around her seem to be reacting in a natural way to what they're witnessing. That was quite enjoyable. We'll leave it for now. Hopefully the second installment will be just as good. Next, we have Carved in the Flesh by Tom Ross and Hilburn. This is another one of those stories set in an asylum where one of the orderlies recalls the story of one of the inmates who always feels bad when he sees red. We actually don't find out what caused him to go insane. We just find out this one horrible thing he has done, which involved cutting the woman he loved because she betrayed him, carving his name on her. I wasn't in love with this story. There's a madman in the asylum and here's his story kind of stories wear thin after a while, I must say. Next, we have The Hall Bedroom by Elwyn Backus. This is another story on insanity, but a much more interesting one. And it's basically a psychiatrist retelling a case he had about a young man who was really not doing well, kept saying he saw two eyes looking at him from this picture in his room. The doctor gets him to get work as a lumberjack out in the woods away. He comes back feeling much better, decides to go back in the room he was renting before. The doctor decides to look in on him, and he finds out from the landlady that there was a tremendous amount of noise the night before. And when they finally got into the room, he was dead. Apparently a big dog or something had attacked him, though there was no dog in the room. Though the window to the outside, even though they're on the second floor, is broken. The doctor goes through the room. He notices that there was an image, and it seems that the frame was broken, but as though something went through it. He also finds the diary of the young man and will read through it and find out that the young man was a gold prospector in the Klondike, killed his partner and the partner's dog. Presumably it's the ghost of the dog that came back to kill him. Nothing that super stands out, but it really wasn't bad either. Certainly after the last two, I quite enjoyed it. Next, we have The Door of Doom by Mary Sharon. This is about a woman who is married to an older man. She wants to sort of get rid of him. She's in love with someone else, and she has a plan, which is to chloroform him and to hide him in a secret compartment in the basement of their house, one that even he doesn't know about because she had it made when he was absent on an expedition to Africa, from which he brought back a gorilla. She doesn't like the animal, and she's insisted that it be locked up at least at night. Anyway, she had this secret room built where she keeps gold that she's accumulating slowly so that she will have the funds to leave her husband. Come the night that she is going to do the deed, she will chloroform her husband. Her plan is to bring him down into the basement. She takes the gold out. She's about to put the body in. And then she finds out the gorilla has not been locked up. And in horror, she backs into the room, which the gorilla then pushes closed. And then when her husband wakes up, he thinks that some thieves came in, might have drugged him and dragged him there. And why he doesn't wonder where the gold came from, I don't know. They were scared by the gorilla and ran off with some of their loot and his wife, neither of which were ever found again. Nothing supernatural, just eerie, and yet another gorilla in a story by Weird Tales. So, The Abysmal Horror is the second part of the serial started last time about some alien plants that are starting to grow that have taken over a large part of the ocean and also parts of the land. Now the story talks about how things get worse. It's set in England, interestingly enough, for an American magazine. And of course, England being relatively small, it's quite beset. North America is doing much better, and while things seem to be getting worse and worse, there's mention of how countries are doing worse because they don't have all the resources available anymore because of international trade being totally at a standstill because no more boats can navigate the seas. When news of an American biologist who has found a bacteria that can kill off the invading plants comes through and a shipment of it arrives, and everywhere in the world people start to use this bacteria to kill off the plant, and they succeed. One of the interesting things about this story is that while they succeed, it's not instantaneous. There's actually talk of people still finding some of these plants for years, but now they have something they can fight it off with. It was also interesting to see that it wasn't just the immediate threat of these weird plants that were considered in the story, but also things like the slowdown in the economy causing rationing, minimal communications that are to be had. People pay for a newspaper, but it's really just one sheet of paper with whatever they can gather from through the wireless, through the radio, whatever official announcements the government may make. So there's an attempt at, going further than just the immediate threat. While the story starts with a main character and he still sort of shows up, he doesn't really do anything other than witness what's happening. And a big chunk of the story doesn't even really concern him all that much. The story does end on a hopeful note, mentioning how the realization that there are things out there that are not human has not stopped war and conflict, but it's lessened the intensity of it as people realize that the person they're in conflict today might be their ally against something alien tomorrow. I did enjoy the serial. It was fun. We can see how these catastrophes coming from outer space, they're going to be popular for decades and decades to come, and not just in the pages of Weird Tales. It's nice to see an early example of that that's well done. Next, we have The Hound by H.P. Lovecraft. This one is about two people who, for aesthetic reasons and for the thrills, will grave rob and collect weird things. And eventually they will go to the Netherlands where they will dig up a grave of somebody who was a sorcerer or something who had a reputation for dark magic and whatnot. One of the things they will take out of the coffin that they dug up is a strange pendant, which they actually recognize because they've read about it in a book. This is the first time this book is mentioned in a story by Lovecraft, and you're probably familiar with the title. They read about it in the Necronomicon. So this is the first time we see a story by Lovecraft that mentions the book by the Mad Arab. Eventually they get back home and they hear noises and have strange happenings come around them. Things will come to a head when the partner of the narrator dies, and when his body is found by the narrator, it's been torn to shreds like by a huge beast of some sort. Panicking, he will take the pendant, destroy all evidence of their collection in case somebody gets into the house. He will take the pendant and bring it back to where they found it, hoping that this will stop the Hound because he feels that he's next. Unfortunately, when he does get to the Netherlands, some thieves take the pendant away from him. He knows this obviously because he doesn't have that pendant, and he reads in the newspaper about a group of lowlives who were gruesomely slaughtered, and he decides to take the only refuge he can with the help of a revolver. Next, we have the third installment of John Martin Leahy's Draconda. You may recall that in the first one, the heroes had built a spaceship and started piloting it to Venus. In the second one, they arrived on the planet, started exploring, and as they were doing so, a meteor destroyed their ship, stranding them on Venus. In this one, they encounter the Venusians that they'd seen some hints might exist. They'd seen a footprint, among other things. Venusians look awfully like regular humans, though they're more primitive. They don't have firearms or advanced technology, at least the ones they encounter, who are from a small tribe. They will travel with them. They will be told that they need to go to Draconda. They're not sure what that is, though eventually I think they somehow figure out she's a queen. When they arrive in the city, they arrive just in time to witness a human sacrifice, which they interrupt, much to the anger of the priests and the assembled crowd. And this installment ends as the crowds rush them and they have to somehow fight them off. Next, we have The Ghost of Silent Smith by Franklin Miller. This is about Silent Smith, who's a pitcher in a baseball team who gets traded. The new pitcher is quite the opposite. He's very talkative, but the team's not doing as well, and the crowd keeps clamoring for Silent Smith to be brought back, and people think the trade was a mistake. And in this very important game in the championships, the team finds out through a telegram that Silent Smith was hit by a ball at a game he was playing elsewhere and passed away. As the game goes on, they're not doing well. The pitcher's not doing as well as he could. And then he himself gets hit by a ball and goes unconscious for 5 or 10 minutes, upon which he wakes up again, but will finish playing the game. But he's acting a lot like Silent Smith used to act, being very taciturn. The way he throws the ball, etc., is like Silent Smith. When the game ends, he collapses, and when he wakes up, he's surprised to find out that he finished the game because the last thing he remembers is being hit by the ball. The narrator is convinced that he was possessed by the ghost of Silent Smith, who won the game for them. This was a fun story. I quite enjoyed it. I'm not a huge baseball fan in general. I know there's quite a few stories like this. I didn't realize they came in so early. Next is Dr. DeBruce by Earl Leaston Bell. This one is narrated by a lawyer who is a friend of the eponymous doctor. The doctor's disappeared for many years, And from out of nowhere, the narrator gets a telegram from him saying to come at once. Heaven and hell depends on it. We find out that the two became friends when the doctor was treating the lawyer's fiance, who unfortunately passed away. When the lawyer gets to the doctor's house after a long train ride, he's quite tired. He rings the doorbell, there's no answer. Eventually, he lets himself in, finding no one there. He figures his friend won't mind him, but he's getting quite tired and he's trying to stay up. Finally, his friend comes back and he seems quite odd, says he's afflicted with some sort of paralysis. It makes it hard for him to talk and move. He will go over some paintings, including a large painting that was turned around so it was facing the wall. And when the lawyer turns it around, he finds it's a portrait of his fiancée, who's looking rather ghastly. She's looking like she did when she passed away from her illness, which included vomiting blood and all sorts of other awful things happening to her. The doctor will admit that he'd fallen in love with her when he found out they were going to get married. He brought 2 glasses of water, one of which was poisoned. His intention was to poison the lawyer, but the 2 glasses got mixed up somehow, and she's the one who died. He did try to nurse her, but the drug he had dosed the water with was just too strong. Since then, he's been trying to atone for his crime. In fact, most of the locals where he lived consider him to be a great benefactor. He would take care of people free of charge, etc. The lawyer will leave the house. He's quite angry. And then he will see a ghostly apparition of his fiancée. And she will say that she's in a better place now, and that she's forgiven the doctor for what he did, and that he should too. She says, but we'll see each other again, don't worry, and in the meantime, here's the wedding ring you had given me. And he will get to the train station, get back home, and find out that the doctor had passed away a few days before. He didn't only see one ghost, he saw 2 ghosts that night. Not quite what I expected from the setup. It certainly kept the twists and turns coming along quite well. It was very well put together. There's no loose ends. The author really maintains the believability of the story throughout, which is nice. Then we have a very short story called The Hater by B.W. Wilson. This is about a man called Ivan Kobelev, who even as a child was quite a hateful and unpleasant character. He joins the army eventually. He's quite a heartless officer, though he's a good leader of men. People are often afraid of him because he will tend to be very severe in his punishment, until he meets a young woman who falls in love with him. They will marry. He will become kinder and softer and a more reasonable person. She will unfortunately fall ill and pass away. He starts becoming more cruel, hating everything around him again. Being cruel and mean brings him no satisfaction until he realizes that he can kill the one person he hates the most, and that is himself. I didn't really go for this story too much. I don't understand why the girl would fall in love with him. Clearly, she must have known his reputation. It didn't do much for me. Next, we have the next Weird Crimes article by Seabury Quinn. This one is called Swatek the Beggar. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. It's presented much more as a fictional story than a factual article, this one. It is about the local beggar who is found to have killed many, many children and young people to eat them. He is found out, tried for his crimes, but before he can be executed, he will hang himself in his cell. I have no idea if there's any truth behind this story. It feels like a written piece of fiction, though it might be based on real facts again. We have the Erie. They do spend quite a bit of time talking about how a few issues ago they made quite a stir, offering to publish the story of the Transparent Ghost should popular demand be there for it. And they publish a few sample letters of people who either really wanted that story or really didn't want that story based on the awful spelling of the original letter. And finally, we have The Killer by Harold Ward, which is at the very end of the magazine and weaves its way through the advertising. It's a relatively short, roughly one-page story. It starts with the killer of the title who arrives at a small cabin in the woods. It's clearly winter, it's very cold. He makes his way inside. The fire's not lit, it's still cold inside. He will find there's a pregnant woman inside. She's about to give birth. She's not been able to light the fire. She thinks at first he's her husband returning home. The killer finds out that the woman's husband is actually the local sheriff who heard about an outlaw who was seen about 30 miles distant and decided to join the posse to hunt him down. Of course, it turns out it's the killer of the title. He will ask for shelter because he's cold, and he will tell her, oh, there was an avalanche after I went through, so that's probably what's delaying your husband. We will find out this killer used to be a doctor, even though he should logically just leave. He decides that the Hippocratic oath that he took years and years ago should be honored, and the story ends with him lighting the fire and then seeing what he can do for the woman and her child. I quite like this story. It's quite well written. Nothing really supernatural or anything, just this odd set of coincidences that quite a few Weird Tales stories have. This one doesn't feel too forced. A nice way to finish this issue. This has been the Grumpy Old Slan, looking at the February 1924 issue of Weird Tales, and I'll see you next time.